next speaker is Mashal Awais. Perhaps, Mashal, you could start and just explain a little bit more about the Bayou City Waterkeeper and what you do there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me today to share about our work. Our topic of today is climate change, water, and environmental justice. This is kind of roughly the agenda that I've put together for today, but we might move things around because of time. But yeah, more about my organization and what it is that we do at Bayou City Waterkeeper. We are a nonprofit organization based out of the Lower Galveston Bay watershed. We focus on 3 program areas for our work. One is protecting wetlands and advocating for nature-based solutions, Clean Water Act, protecting and ensuring clean water for our communities, and ensuring just climate transitions. So all of this work is sort of really interconnected, and we use the law and science to advocate for clean water in our communities and in our watershed. So what is the Lower Galveston Bay watershed? So here you can see an image that shows a map of the Lower Galveston Bay watershed. We've updated this map since this picture, but in general, we have roughly about 120,000 acres of complete wetlands. This number also varies based on how wetlands are determined legally. We have 3 major rivers. We're one of the 4th largest cities in the United States and one of the 3rd most populous county, Harris County. So it's a huge area, lots of water, lots of bayous, lots of wetlands, and lots of fun things that come with that, and lots of diversity, not only in the people that live here in this watershed, but also ecologic diversity, which doesn't really get enough light of day, but I'm sure that some of the earlier speakers today talked about that as I was looking at the agenda. So I just wanted to highlight this part of our work in terms of how we identify our region. As of last year, we've identified these 5 areas as critical wetland areas. And if you look at just the map, you can see these 5 areas identified as these green highlighted areas: Lake Houston wetlands, the Greater Lake Creek, Greater Katy Prairie area, Trans-Brazos region, and Anahuac coastal marsh and prairie wetland area. So why these 5 areas have been deemed critical is to be able to protect what we have, and the reason for us to protect wetlands is for their many ecologic benefits, but also the benefit that they serve for our region in terms of flood protection, in terms of water quality, and in terms of climate change. Really, these are protecting large tracts of wetlands is a way to ensure flood protection for our region, especially our coastal areas. So next, I want to talk a little bit more about community science. And what exactly community science is really that it is community-centered and it is community-driven. It is using the expertise of local community members and ensuring collective empowerment. So it focuses on place-based knowledge and learning. So really working with local experts, local community partners like yourselves. I'm really inspired always by talking to educators, and my mom is a teacher, so it's always incredible to be in a room full of, or a space, virtual space full of teachers and educators like yourselves, because we believe in collecting information and gathering data collectively. And we're really rooted in data to action, and how we collect data, how we analyze data is really to further our advocacy and inform decision makers to make the best decisions for our community. And really the last piece is the interconnectivity piece, working with the local knowledge that I mentioned, but we also interweave that with like the interdisciplinary angle of science. So making science more accessible to community members, making science more interdisciplinary, and working with other sociologists and to weave in the qualitative aspects of data as well. A little bit more about what community science is. This is more for like academic audiences, is like how we can transition traditional science, which was very academic focused, and really creating relevance in science. And that's especially important for our region, I believe, because of the challenges that we face in the Gulf Coast. And working with the new data that we have and the newer technologies, and recognizing, like I mentioned previously, community members as experts. and it helps to build local expertise. It builds our capacity as scientific experts. And then some of the other work that we do at Bayou City Waterkeeper I mentioned is the just climate transitions. And one of the huge pieces of just climate transitions is really bridging the information gap and recognizing that there is an information gap, that there is a lack of data that people have access to, and who has access to data is a justice issue and an equity issue as well. So we really at Bayou City Waterkeeper work to be the strategic liaison between government, academic, and community experts. And more recently, we've been partnering with Spatial Studies Lab at Rice University to build out our visualizations and make data and science more accessible to community members. Now I want to transition into environmental pollution and talk more about water in general and what that means for our region. So this is just a GIF that shows all the different types of pollution that people get exposed to, and you'll see air pollution, noise pollution, water pollution, land pollution, visual pollution. So oftentimes, just generally when we're looking at risk for communities, we're looking at one type of pollution, but it's really just advocating for community members and recognizing that people are exposed to pollution from multiple different aspects. So communities, like I'll talk about in more detail later, when we're looking at communities that live along the ship channel, for example, in the Houston area, not only are they getting exposed to pollutants from the refinery from air, but they're also getting exposed from groundwater contamination, water pollution, and other soil and noise-based pollution as well. So there's like that multi-pathway of exposure that we have to kind of calculate when we're calculating risk for communities. But here, more focusing on water and our footprint, I know I heard a little bit of the conversation earlier where we're talking about food. And I think when we're thinking about water, there's direct sources of how we consume water, and then there's indirect sources of how we're consuming water. So our direct sources of water are municipal tap water, water that we use for domestic purposes, for cleaning, recreation, for cooking, for drinking. And then there's indirect sources of water, that being agriculture, medicine, personal, electricity, all the other industries that rely on water, and the systems that are relying on water to be able to function. So these are just kind of some images, and I can share this presentation with y'all later so you can spend more time with it. I wanted to play this video.
We all need water. But only 2.5% of the water that exists on Earth is fresh water. That's not very much. Knowing where fresh water is and how we manage it can help us provide a solution to one of our most pressing problems, making sure there is enough water to sustain all living things on the planet. So where is this water, and how much is there of it? About 70% is in the form of ice, 30% is groundwater, and lastly only 1.2% is surface water, namely rivers, lakes, ground moisture, permafrost and water present in the atmosphere. It's a common perception that fresh water exists only in rivers and lakes, but most liquid fresh water is actually hidden underground and can be found in the most unexpected places. So, who uses this water and how is it managed? Domestic use accounts for 11% of total freshwater consumption, industry 19%, and agriculture 70%. Apart from fisheries and aquaculture, farmers grow and breed the vast majority of the food we eat, using the greater part of the planet's freshwater resources. Two terms have been coined to refer to the water used by agriculture: blue water and green water. When rain falls over a field, some of that water gets stored in the upper soil as moisture. This is called green water and accounts for most of the water used in agriculture. Blue water makes up all surface water such as rivers, lakes, as well as groundwater. These resources are exploited for irrigation when droughts occur and rainfall is scarce. Often these irrigation techniques are not efficient and can easily deplete aquifers, rivers and lakes. Industry is the second largest water user, mainly due to the fact that 90% of all electricity generation is water intensive. The current water usage in agriculture and industry is not sustainable. But we are also personally responsible for the global water footprint. We know about the water usage of a typical household. In developed countries, each person uses up to 300 litres of water every day. Washing the dishes, 30 litres of water per day. Taking a shower, up to 80 litres of water per day. Flushing a toilet, 65 litres per day. Doing the laundry, up to 100 litres per load. But we consume far more water than we might realise. In fact, we each consume as much as 5,000 litres of water every day. About 90% of our water consumption is invisible to us. This is what we call virtual water. Water is essential for the production of just about everything, from goods to electricity to manufactured products. But mostly for the food we eat. Meet Daisy. Daisy needs 8,500 kilograms of wheat, corn, grain and roughage to reach maturity over a period of 3 years. It takes 3,060,000 litres of water to grow her food. We also need to take into account the 24,000 litres of water she drinks during these 3 years, not to mention the 7,000 litres used to service the farmhouse, transportation, and for the process of slaughter. In total, we then need almost 3.1 million litres of water to produce 200 kilos of boneless beef. That is more than 5,000 litres for a modest 300-gram steak. Obviously, not everyone on the planet consumes the same amounts of fresh water each day. In fact, people living in developed countries are a privileged minority. Think that 3 billion people still lack access to safe drinking water. That's almost half the Earth's population. It would make a queue of people long enough to stretch to the moon and back again. All of us, and people in developed countries in particular, must be aware how our water consumption affects the planet and all living things in it. In the era of technology and information, ignorance about our water footprint is unacceptable. Globalization has shrunk the world. We are all highly interconnected, and our consumption patterns have an impact much beyond our local communities. Live sustainably. Act responsibly. Let's not lose sight of the bigger picture.
Okay, great. So that was from 2015, apparently, and apologies for it being mostly in liters, because I know we use gallons here in the US. But I think it just kind of gives us some sense of scale of what we're looking at oftentimes, and looking at the global scale of water and our water footprint. And then just coming back to how we continue to think about how we interact with water, I kind of like to think about some of the not so good interactions that we have with water. And we see that often in our Houston area in multiple different ways. Flooding is huge. So I've just taken some screenshots to show you. We have sanitary sewer overflows that kind of go into our bayous and our rivers and end up in our Gulf. People getting exposed to harmful chemicals in the events of floods and heavy extreme rain events. These are also pictures of, I'm forgetting what this is from, but I'm going to say it's Harvey, but just showing how people get sort of like the mass scale of what we've seen in our watershed when it comes to being exposed to water. And then just trash that lives in our bayous. Just some screenshots of what different aspects of water can be when we have unsafe drinking water conditions, when water smells kind of different. And then there's some other good interactions with water. So oftentimes I think when people talk about Houston, we talk about flooding, we talk about like how bad it is when it rains and things like that, and especially in kind of like the work that we do and trying to talk about flood equity, that kind of gets brought up a lot. But then there's also all these really good interactions that we have with water that get masked often when we're living in this sort of disaster-prone city. and flood-prone city. So some of the good interactions are obviously the recreation. There's a lot of kayaking opportunities along the bayous of Houston. When the weather's nice, I really encourage you all to go out. This is, I think, Armand Bayou Nature Center, access to public pools, and people going out and fishing. Some of the things that we think about with fishing is how safe the water is. And this is an image of last year. We went into drought, so I'm not going to play this clip, but often, I'm not sure if y'all are into fishing, but there's huge risk of fishing, especially in our watershed when we're consuming fish, because some of the fish is exposed to harmful chemicals just because of the nature of lack of regulation with industry and the environmental toxins and pollutants that live in our waters. And then also, when we think about swimming, the other question that we ask ourselves is it safe to swim? So here I've taken a screenshot of like sewage discharge in Brazoria County beaches, and then how some of our water is some of the worst in terms of water quality, actually. So, I mean, I go to Galveston at least once, a couple of times a year, but is the water safe? And sometimes we'll see swim advisories. There's high levels of dioxins and PCBs that are in our ship channel and our bayous. So questions that we need to ask ourselves as we interact with the water is the water safe? There are resources out there such as Swim Guide that you all can check. It's an app you can download. You can also look at it on the website, and then you can see people are doing water quality tests to see which beaches are safe at certain times of the year. So I'd really encourage you all to look at that when you're interacting with the water in our watershed. And then I just want to talk a little bit more about environmental regulations and the importance of environmental regulations. So like I mentioned, Bayou City Waterkeeper really works at the intersection of science and law, meaning that we work with the law and we use the Clean Water Act and the citizen provisions within the Clean Water Act to protect our water and protect our communities. So we also rely on the Endangered Species Act. We look at local regulations like the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality and our water standards. We look at NEPA, and that's not my area of expertise. We do have a legal director that works on all of that, so I work in partnership with her. So I just wanted to take a moment to pause. I know I share a lot of high-level sort of information, and maybe if one or two of you all want to share maybe a positive experience interacting with our waterway or a negative experience.
I would say most positive experience interacting with waterways is enjoying the shoreline wildlife, especially the birds. I do like that. Negative interaction would be flooding. Basically, every time it rains, I'm checking all the drains, I'm checking the water in the backyard, I'm checking the water at the curb, and
moving the cars out of the street, checking the driveway.
Yes. So yes, it's every time we get a heavy rain, it's that kind of, oh, are we going to flood? Are we going to flood? It's that sort of. And I'm living in a house that has actually never flooded. So I hate to think what it's like for people who live in homes that have flooded.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I used to enjoy the rain every time it rained until I moved to Houston. And I always used to think like, why is everyone so grumpy when it rains here? And now I'm the same way. I'm like, okay, when's this rain going to be over? I don't want the streets to flood. This is another question that I'd like to ask. Since we do live in this space where we're always experiencing a lot of flood and flood events, I wanted to hear what you all think. If we live in a surplus of water, or do we need to conserve water in our city?
So I teach this one in my class. I know the answer to this one.
Yeah, feel free to share.
Well, because it's a really important question. We've been ranked the second most water stressed city in the country behind LA. This city, while we got a lot of surface water, in terms of available water and flooding issues, in terms of available water for industry, for communities, we don't have a surplus. We have a shortage.
That's exactly right. I saw Penny, maybe you went off mic. Did you want to share something?
Yeah, the conservation is important. I have visited a daughter who lived over in the Dominican Republic who did not have available water, and watched them try to collect on the roofs, and you couldn't drink the water. So they were all using plastic bottled water, and they didn't have recycling. So bottles were everywhere. And yeah, it made me so much more aware of waste.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Like I said, for us, we see so much water and we experience a lot of rain, but we really are a water stressed city, and we have extracted a lot of our groundwater to where we can't use our groundwater or rely on it for drinking water. And as Houston and the greater Houston area continues to expand west and north and into all these different counties and regions, we are continuing to tap into more groundwater sources. And most of it is probably going to like water front yards or backyards, So the more that we can kind of raise this awareness of like, no, we need to protect the water supplies that we have for our future generations, and really to be able to prevent us from a sinking city. There's that risk too. I think if any one of y'all are familiar with Baytown or more of the coastal areas, that's a huge risk for our communities and our coast because of subsidence. So we do need to think about that a lot as well.
Excuse me.
Yes.
You just mentioned subsidence down south, but it's actually also a problem up north. The Woodlands is struggling with areas of subsidence as well. And that's why I think they've been looking at changing a lot more to surface water, but then surface water versus groundwater is so much more energy intensive. And the process for cleaning it and the chemicals that are needed are worse. So I remember when they switched in the spring area, they had to add a lot more chemicals. And we had a time period where we had a lot of yellow water and water that it was going through like a significant change, and it tasted bad as well. So I try to teach that to my students a lot as well, as like how important it is to save water, because they keep on tapping into aquifers, and then the problem with surface water is then we're taking it away from the areas that it should be going to initially anyway, where we're pulling it from our estuaries and everything as we pull it from the Trinity River.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. Yeah, that's a huge thing as well. It's not just coastal communities. It is exactly right. Like wherever we're going, we're maxing out the groundwater, and we're having to rely more and more on surface water. And that has huge health risks for ourselves as well, because we're not following the same drinking water standards as like some of the other states. So we'll see a lot more contamination kind of coming through our water, and some of the research is also unfolding. A lot of those kind of forever chemicals like PFAS is coming to light a lot more. Is like, how do we filter out PFAS if it's everywhere and it has impact on our health? So surface water is definitely not as good as for consumption as groundwater. So thank you for sharing. So this is an image of a wastewater treatment plant during Hurricane Harvey. And I share this just to share a little bit more of our advocacy around sanitary sewer overflows and what that has led to in the city of Houston. What we're looking at with the city of Baytown right now is hopefully moving into the city's maintaining and upgrading their infrastructure when it comes to wastewater treatment plants. And the city of Houston is now in a consent decree for the next 15 years to invest $2 billion. And we at Bayou City Waterkeeper are tracking how they're making updates to their wastewater treatment systems and where sanitary sewer overflows continue to occur, mostly for environmental justice issues as well. So this shows you really just how problematic it can be when our infrastructure is aging. We're not making it prepared for climate adaptation and climate mitigation. When we see extreme events like Hurricane Harvey, raw sewage goes into everyone's backyards, and this water is really unsafe. So when people are displaced, they have to wade through flooded waters. There's a huge health risk to that too. This image I shared previously, sanitary sewer overflow that you can see happening where raw sewage is just going into a waterway. This is just more screenshots of the same sort of issues with wastewater spills occurring. And that's the kind of thing that better regulations, making sure that our clean water standards are met is really critical. So with Bayou City Waterkeeper's engagement in the consent decree process, we're now in this consent decree. So the city of Houston is going to be making infrastructure updates and improving its wastewater system. And it is needed mostly not just for Houston. This is a national issue. Wastewater treatment plants and infrastructure generally that was put out is now at its age, to where it needs to be either upgraded, maintained, or replaced. So it's at 50 years or near 50 years. So a lot of cities are seeing this type of failing infrastructure in terms of wastewater treatment plants. And we're really at Bayou City Waterkeeper advocating for doing that type of upgrades for our region. Last year, we launched a tool called Justice in the Sewers, where we're looking at where sanitary sewer overflows are occurring. We have data from the past 2 years, and we're looking at it and this data is available publicly. So the city of Houston now posts it on its website every month. I can share the link with you all, but you can see it on our website as well. So here we're looking at where sanitary sewer overflows are occurring in relation to demographics. So you'll see where majority percent Hispanic or Latino or Black African American communities are from the census data. There's a lot more overflows that have been reported, and then the larger circles are showing higher volumes of overflows, so more gallons, and the smaller circles are showing less quantity. So this image kind of shows you also what we call in the environmental justice world, the Houston arrow, where the percent white communities experience less of these injustices across the spectrum when we're looking at air quality, when we're looking at water quality, when we're looking at where proximity to chemical contamination is. All those types of things, we continuously see this thing which we call the Houston arrow. So here again, you'll see the Houston arrow, which is this bluish color where there's a lot more wealthier communities. So here we have the ACS median household income overlapped with the same data of sanitary sewer overflows. And you'll see the lower income communities, which are the sort of like light brown color, are experiencing a lot more of these overflows. So this is sort of for us to see where these overflows are occurring and kind of like if there is a relation between how the infrastructure was laid down, when maintenance was done, and maybe to create this sort of like prioritization of like really advocating for communities of color to be having better access to resources so that they can maybe like prioritize infrastructure improvements in these communities before sort of where we're seeing less overflows occur. On the website, if you go to the Justice in the Sewers website, you'll see these black dots as well. And the black dots are showing private sewer laterals. So overflows that are occurring on private property. And that is also, if you look at the trend or on the map, you'll see them occurring more in Black and brown communities. So we're really trying to advocate for the city of Houston to prioritize focusing on these communities and these neighborhoods as they look into their consent decree. And the issue with the private sewer laterals, if you've ever experienced any sewage issues in your property or if you're homeowners, is that the city of Houston is not responsible for those private lines. So the weight of the burden of that falls on the individual. So I think that that's where income really does play a huge role, is if you are in a low income community and we're seeing higher trends of private sewer lateral issues, is that this might be something that communities that are lower income are not able to afford. So that's why we're seeing a higher ratio of these in lower income communities. I think if we can look at these questions and maybe we can go off microphone, maybe we'll take the first question and just I'll read that out and any one of y'all can go off mic and share. So what is the most important issue related to you when it comes to water? Is it climate change? Is it poor regulation of our sanitary sewer system? Is it flooding? Or is it just the cost of water? Or anything else that you'd like to share? So
I have a quick question about this. The private city sewer laterals that you were talking about, is that why do they have those as opposed to using city water?
This is city water. So this is in the city's wastewater system. These are the private lines and the pipelines. So it's more of like when the pipe goes in and onto private property, anything that occurs as a leak or an overflow or anything, the city is not responsible for the repair on private property. So the burden of that repair falls on the individual. So we see a higher trend of that in communities of color and in lower income communities. Does that answer the question?
Well, yeah. So now that gives me another question. So private sewer laterals are all over the city. That's normal, right?
They are all over the city, but I can show you where they occur more.
I mean, is that anytime you own a property, you have a private city lateral?
Yes, unless you're on a septic system or not on the city system, you are connected to the city. So here, this is the justice and the sewers map. So sewage releases on private property. Here you can see kind of like the screenshot that I was showing, and the black dots are representing where these private sewer lateral issues have been reported by 311 calls, most likely. So if you can overlay this information. Yes, so if you look at sewage releases on private property, and if you click on income, it shows you the income demographics here, and then you'll see where they're occurring more. And if you click on any of these dots, this is the information that the city sort of has shared with us, or not with us, which is public information. It's on the city's website. So that's kind of how the city's information is appearing on their website. You can scroll through. Here it says consent decree. You can click the consent decree. It takes you to the Houston consent decree website. And then this is all the data that we've populated on the Justice and the Sewers Experience Builder. So you can see all their monthly SSO reports, an overview and an update on their consent decree and things like that. So lots of data to look at. Anything else?
I would like to add to that, because we had a problem with our connection to the sewer, the city sewer. And first of all, I'd like to say it cost us not hundreds but thousands of dollars to fix, and we live in what we consider to be a very nice middle-class neighborhood. And the problem was caused by shoddy building when the house was built. I mean, it was just like one pipe was forced at an angle and shoved into another pipe. And so it, with stress, it broke over time. I hate to think how badly houses are constructed in neighborhoods where they go for cheaper prices, or maybe with older housing or whatever. They must have a huge problem. And it's not a cheap one to fix, especially when they come by and they say, well, it's on your property, your problem.
Yeah, Andrew, I see you off mic. Would you like to share something?
Yeah, I had a question about that Houston Arrow phenomenon. And you do see the trend that the infrastructure problem in communities of color and impoverished wards in Houston, was anything looked at like, why is that trend happening? Is it just older infrastructure and then they just really don't invest in that area compared to other wards that are more wealthy, or is it just because it's just an older system?
So this is sort of connecting to a lot of the environmental justice issues and sort of like the systemic issues of how the city has been designed. Redlining is a huge part of it. So on our website, I think we also mentioned redlining, I believe, just the way that the city has been designed and who occupied what part of the city sort of funneled people of color, lower income people into certain communities and certain neighborhoods, and then the way that the infrastructure was maintained over time, how the roads were built, how the drains were built, how the sewer lines were laid out. So all of that is sort of like that systemic racism and the systemic injustices that exist in, quite frankly, the history of the United States and a lot of how cities have been designed. So redlining is, I think, the big sort of connector when it comes to that. And I shared a link. One Breath Partnership has done a good job in explaining the Houston Arrow and talking about historic redlining through the city of Houston over time. So you all can read that. But that's kind of like the issue also when we see Black and Brown communities at the front line of the climate crisis, is because they're more in the floodplain. When they're exposed in the floodplains and their homes are built in a 100-year floodplain, then they're more likely to be flooded out and have a less chance of recovery. So that's a lot of when we were talking about flood inequity and flood justice and equitable flood infrastructure, that's kind of what we're talking about. So you'll see that through multiple different patterns. So that's why we call it the Houston Arrow. Does that answer the question?
Yes. How would you define like redlining? I don't understand that word.
Let me see if I have a picture. Redlining in Houston. So there is a map. Unfortunately, I spent a lot of time. Fortunately or unfortunately, there's like maps that talk about this. I don't know if this is the best link, but this has a type of map that sort of, yeah, it is a little bit of how the city was designed, and basically, yeah, here you can see where the green areas were is what was favorable for people to live in, and the red and yellow here, C and D, are sort of like, it wasn't the best place to live, basically. And that's just how the city was kind of laid out. So you can see that sort of trend continuing, sort of like the wealth and poverty pieces of the inequities that we see in our cities. So this is maybe not the best. Yeah, there's a couple of articles that I can share with you. This one would be good as well, but it is a little bit more detailed to understand sort of like that urban planning piece of it. But yeah, that just to show that all of it is connected, and how people experience inequities in our city is connected to that. The next thing I'm going to talk about is climate justice and environmental justice. I wanted to play this video of what environmental justice is.
Environmental justice really reflects the fundamental reality that vulnerable communities are all too often subject to the disproportionate burden of pollution and contamination. At the end of the day, when we're talking about environmental impacts, at the heart of it are real people's lives. And if you think about one child who's in her home that maybe has lead paint on the walls, she's drinking water from the tap that might have lead contamination in it. She plays in a playground that has arsenic in the soil and is developing asthma because of the polluting facilities next door. She goes into her school that has mold inside. These are real things that happen on an everyday basis. Not everybody has the ability to simply uproot themselves from a community where they've lived for decades, where their families raise them, where they raise their children. People don't have the financial mobility necessarily to simply get up and go. How do we combat environmental injustice? There are things like litigation. That means continue fighting in the courts, continue fighting to strengthen existing legislation, fighting to ensure that existing legislation is actually being enforced. Things like community organizing, public education, mobilizing the base, and elevating voices. And there's also things like using media as an outlet to get your point across. In today's day and age, especially with this administration, I think there are an enormous amount of hurdles in how to address environmental injustices. But the reality is we have to keep fighting. Great gains do not occur overnight. They take sometimes decades. I truly believe that environmental justice is the modern-day civil rights issue of our time.
So with that sort of video overview of what environmental justice is, I kind of want to talk a little bit about climate justice. And when we talk about climate justice, we really are building on the foundations of environmental justice coupled with the reality of climate change and what that would look like for our region. So what does climate justice and environmental justice look like in our region? I think it's really important for us to understand where we live, and that's kind of like the Justice in the Sewers project sort of illustrates that, of who is exposed to the contamination, who is at the most climate risk when it comes to our region. We're not even looking at it at a global perspective, but where your home is, what you're exposed to, what your line of work is, where your school is, all these things come into play. And it is evident that certain communities are more vulnerable in our region than others in terms of environmental exposures to chemicals and toxins, and also in the wake of climate change. So really, when we advocate for climate justice, we're advocating for communities that have the highest vulnerability in our watershed to be protected, and really for policies to be put in place and laws to protect these people, and resources. I think that the thing that this illustrates also is like a lack of resources going into communities that need it the most. So the distribution of resources needs to be reprioritized. I'd like to share this other tool that we use a lot, and maybe this is useful for y'all if you're not familiar with it. It's called EPA's EJ Screen. This is environmental justice screening and mapping tool. So this, if you can see, is very user-friendly. And again, here You can look at different pollution sources. You can click different contaminants that you're interested in. If you want to look at lead paint, for example, you'll see where the highest percentile of people that are exposed to lead is. And that's important for educators. I think that's very important for us to look at, because when we're educating children and young people, lead is a huge issue. Then we also have wastewater discharge. So there's a lot of different indicators that you can pick. Climate change data. This is new. So this has been recently updated. So now they have the sea level rise information as well. So you can click to see vulnerability if you add 2 feet of sea level rise. And then you're also in a floodplain. These type of things kind of really show you where communities, and then where there's low life expectancy, for example. So you'll continue to see the sort of trends that we've illustrated of where communities that we've identified as vulnerable and at the greatest risk. So you can turn some of these layers on and off and see some of these trends and kind of advocate for better regulation to protect communities that are at the highest risk. And I think that that's a very useful tool. Thank you so much, Ms. Kathleen, for explaining more about redlining. I'm obviously not a planner, so I forget some of the history of, but that's exactly right, where people could purchase homes that determined where they ended up living. I have a couple more slides, just I think showing what the video was talking about as well, where people are exposed to, what different exposure points are when it comes to environmental contamination. So this picture shows you if there's a drum that's leaked, all the multiple pathways of exposure. So the contamination can go into your groundwater, which can come into the stream. From the groundwater, it could go into your home. The drum could, on the surface, you could be directly exposed to that and be, if you're touching the contamination, but then it could also transport in air through vapor and dust. So a lot of this stuff is something that might be far removed from some of our lives, but this is something that if you go to the Houston Ship Channel, if you go to frontline communities that live near refineries such as Valero, they experience this type of stuff every day. So it might not be a chemical drum, but it could be just the environmental toxins from flaring or things like that that they're experiencing on an everyday basis. So we have to think about all of these different things when we're kind of coming up with environmental calculating risk. Also talking about the common types of pollutants. And then really towards the end of it, there's a video that y'all can look at more talking about climate justice and what that looks like and how youth really is at the front line of the climate movement. I've worked with a lot of youth in the past in the Houston area, and I'm really inspired by a lot of the youth advocacy groups that exist in the Houston area that really are illustrating the need for climate justice in our region. Here, I wanted to share that I'm also vice chair of the Community Flood Resilience Task Force, where we work with the Harris County Flood Control District and really centering community voice and conservation and flood equity, and really kind of working with the county to come up with equitable solutions for flood infrastructure. And that we are not alone, that this is a global movement, that there are multiple groups working together. It takes a village, it is a coalition effort to kind of bring these issues to the forefront of what we're experiencing. And I really hope for creating a better future for all. And with that, I want to open up for questions and really thank you for your time. Really grateful to be here and to share this Saturday morning with y'all. And thank you so much for listening to me for over 30 minutes. That's a lot. I appreciate y'all.
Well, thank you so much, Mashal. That was very interesting. I think you provided us with some fantastic resources as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Mashal, that was great. That was wonderful. And I'm delighted to see that Bayou Waterkeeper has taken on this particular issue, because we can't have enough voices about it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.